It's interesting though, because that's the critical question. You know, there is an hysteria, and I'd be curious to I guess hear from you and Paris too. Like, when did that shift? When did we go from when did we go from welcoming the Vietnamese? I mean, what happened in that period of time?
Okay, well, that's a fair question. And the real difference was the political difference. Howard was the first person who was willing to play the race card openly, stimulated by the example of Pauline Hanson. He and his fellow reptiles decided to vote in beating up on asylum seekers.
Yes, but
and you know,
the Keating government introduced mandatory detention, though.
What's that?
The Keating government introduced mandatory detention.
And the interesting thing is, if this is supposed to be a deterrent, have a look at the figures. The unauthorised arrival rate for about 7 years before mandatory detention was introduced was running at 1,000 a year, and for the next 7 years after the introduction, it ran at about 1,000 a year. The deterrent effect was zero. And anyone who argues otherwise, frankly, hasn't got the facts.
Bring that microphone in a bit, actually, Paris, because you're very softly spoken.
I think that's right. There is, in fact, there's never been any evidence produced to support the claim that detention in and of itself was an effective deterrent. There's a lot of claim about that, but I've been as close to it as a number of people have been, and I haven't been able to get anyone to produce that evidence for me. And they can't produce it because it's not real. The answer to your question, in my view, is that it's predominantly a political one. Any government or political party, their reason for existing is to win government. And the political currency around asylum issues and migration issues and so forth has been on the rise for quite some time now, right throughout the world. In Europe, it has swung elections. It's given rise in Le Pen in France. Didn't do well in the presidential elections, did extremely well in local government elections. It changed the balance in the Netherlands, it changed the balance in Denmark. At the time when Tampa hit here, Norway was about to go into an election. And in fact, one of the things that the opposition used at the time, and ultimately was successful against the government of the day in Norway, was their position in opposition to how Australia was dealing with the Tampa. If you go to the UK, the tabloids, every day, page 3 or 4, there is another case of belted asylum seekers. And I think you can't underestimate the impact that the political currency of this issue has generated, because that then influences the type of political leadership that people are prepared to provide on this issue. And I think the jury's still out on where we are on that front yet. And I don't know where we'll be if we get another 6 or 7 votes in a very short period of time. That would be the real test. But if I go back to when the Cambodians were in detention, when Keating won the unwinnable election, and there was a number of Cambodians who'd been in detention for 3 years, I had a conversation with the then Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration, who ended up being the head of ASIO and ended up in the US as our ambassador, Dennis Richardson, asking what he thought we could do to change detention policy. And his words still ring in my ears. He said, "Paris, you have to change the mind of the Parliament, because it's become a mindset in the Parliament that it's essential for whatever political reason, and turning it around isn't going to happen without a shift at that level." And I think Dennis was right at that point in time.
Can I say something about deterrence? Let it be supposed that deterrence is put forward genuinely by people, by the public or by politicians, as a reason for a harsh deterrent, a harsh system in mandatory detention. I would invite people to examine the ethical decency of a policy of deterrence. What it amounts to is mistreating innocent people in order to deter other people from seeking our help. Now, a mind experiment gives you a line into this. Let's suppose I could guarantee this government that no asylum seeker will ever come to Australia asking for our help. if you'll let me do just one thing. For the rest of time, no more asylum seekers will come here seeking help. What you have to do is let me take a couple of kids from the detention centre and publicly execute them. I don't think many Australians would support that. That would be simply punishing a couple extremely in order to deter everyone else forever. And if that's a bit rough, well then, what about if we just take half a dozen of them and torture them publicly? Not to the point of organ failure, not your Rumsfeld kind of torture, but just short of that. And I think most Australians would be a bit squeamish about that too, and would say, no, you can't torture children. We won't even go along with torturing adults in order to deter others. But if it's done in the South Australian desert, behind the razor wire, where no one can see it, then apparently that's all right. You can punish innocent people as a deterrent, as long as we don't see the details. Now that's morally bankrupt.
And that's the political issue, currency issue, because when you paint people on a boat as a faceless horde of invaders wanting to come to our shore, and you run a poll in the Herald Sun and say, should we let them in? It's not surprising that 95% say no. But if you take a mother and a child and put them in front of that same group of Australians, I bet you a lot of dollars most will say, oh, we don't really mean them. And that's a different, it's a different dynamic. And one of the things that makes me believe in that view quite strongly was the way in which some of the activism and groups that sprung up out of that, for example, Rural Australians for Refugees, people who you would never, in rural communities here, you would never have predicted that. Once asylum seekers who were lucky enough to be released were working in those communities, were living next door to people where they got to see they were the same as us, the attitude changed differently. And that's why I think we had centres in such isolated locations. It was part of the image of keeping the humanity of that experience away from the public.
I also think that the former government did a really good job in making out that these people weren't deserving of our sympathy because they had done something wrong. And so talking about sort of queue jumpers and sort of giving the impression that there's some kind of orderly system whereby a person should wait in their country, wait to be persecuted, and then apply to the Australian government and come under some other scheme. But as I mentioned earlier, the definition of a refugee is a person who is outside their country of nationality. The Refugee Convention was formulated on the supposition that a person would leave their country, would actually arrive in another country unauthorised without documents and apply for asylum. And so it's quite false to put forward this idea that a refugee, a genuine refugee, will wait calmly somewhere in a camp until we, in our benevolence, take pity on that person. But I think that's been quite effective in encouraging Australians to think, well, these people have done something wrong and therefore somehow appropriately being punished.
Well, given that though, given that the consensus seems to be that it's that the greatest driver in all of this is actually about is politics, is kind of trying to write and read public opinion. Given that we've just had a kind of change of government that came in many ways with these sorts of changes in refugee policy on its agenda, they were priorities for the
mentioned, but not prominently.
Pacific Solution, I think, was one of the things. Well, okay, all right.
I think it was really industrial relations.
Perhaps I was wearing the tinted glasses.
In fact, they did everything to avoid having it on the agenda.
Okay, but fair enough. But then they've gone ahead and done it. So I'm curious then, given that this message then is a different one, given that the message is we will abandon, we will get rid of Nauru. We don't quite know what we're going to do with Christmas Island. It's still waiting there to be opened and it can house families. But we're not going to talk about that at the moment. The TPVs, those sorts of issues, the abandonment, the getting rid of the temporary protection visas. What then, given that we all felt that over the 11.5 years prior to that there was a very clear agenda of sending message to the Australian community, what then does this...
I thought we meant to be sending messages to the people overseas.
Well, yes, those too, but I'm wondering though, given that there has been a political will, has it stopped? Is that sort of tick those boxes and there isn't going to be any follow-on from that? Or is there a legal, or is there a way that this actually moves forward?